Hello and welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Tonight's movie is 1947's The Sin of Harold Diddlebock, directed by Preston Sturges. I have to tell you at the outset, this movie was a bit of a disappointment to me. I mean, it was directed by Preston Sturges, one of the best comedy directors of all time, and starred Harold Lloyd, one of the biggest silent movie comedians of all time. I was expecting quite a bit, and that's probably why I was disappointed. This isn't to say that the movie isn't good, I just found it adequate. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get down to cases. The Sin of Harold Diddlebock, also known as Mad Wednesday, uses the silent film The Freshman as a jumping-off point to set up this film, although in The Freshman his character was named Harold Lamb. I haven't seen that particular movie, but here's a synopsis. The Freshman concerned Harold entering college determined to become the big man on campus. He does a plethora of things he's certain will secure him this position, but in reality all he does is embarrass himself with the help of a fellow student who is ostensibly helping him, but actually sabotaging his every move. He tries to get on the football team to achieve his dreams, but the total lack of playing ability gets him the job of the water boy. He gets humiliated throughout the entire movie, but at the end he's put into the football game and somehow saves the day. In tonight's movie, the actual footage shot for the silent film is intermixed with newly shot footage for this film, and it's pretty obvious which is which. I myself think they should have used vintage equipment to shoot the new inserts to make it match a little better. It's not like the equipment or stock wasn't available, but I'm just nitpicking here. Anyway, at the end of the game, Harold gets an offer to join an advertising firm and takes the guy up on it several years later when he graduates. After Waggleberry, the guy who offered him the job, remembers who he is, he starts as a bookkeeper with the aforementioned Waggleberry telling him that his career is only limited by his drive. He starts the job hanging a bunch of platitudes on the wall next to his desk. Things like lips that touch liquor will never touch mine and that kind of stuff. He's actually a bit tight-ass, which didn't exactly make me sympathetic. 22 years later, he's still a lowly bookkeeper worshipping from afar, or at least down the aisle from, Miss Otis, a pretty co-worker. He plans on asking her to marry him when he gets established, but that never happens because he gets fired. All he has is his pension, which amounts to $2,946.12. Today, that'd be around $35,500. Depressed, he's walking down the street and meets a raggedy-looking racetrack tout who takes him to a bar. Harold, not surprisingly, has never had a drink in his life, and this inspires the bartender to create a rather potent new drink he dubs the Diddlebock. Harold takes a drink, yells the most irritating yell I've heard in a long time, and goes hog wild, spending his money on clothing, carousing, and betting on a horse race. He wins and then blows the rest of his money buying a circus. The next day, his maiden sister informs him of what he's done, and he's horrified. He then does a bunch of wacky things to extricate himself from the situation. Hilarity ensues. Preston Sturges wrote the script for this movie in order to lure Harold Lloyd out of retirement, and unfortunately it worked. I will be the first to admit that maybe I wasn't the audience for this movie. I just didn't care for it that much. I found the character of that Harold played to be an annoying, prissy milquetoast who didn't elicit my sympathy at all. And don't even get me started about how often he says, "Jackie, Jackie, Jackie," while he's trying to corral his newly purchased but errant lion. I know that doesn't make sense, but watch the movie and all will be made clear. It is, however, worth watching to see Margaret Hamilton smile on camera. I haven't seen many movies directed by Preston Sturges. I mean, I've seen 1941 Sullivan's Travels, which was a pretty good movie. 1944 is The Miracle of Morgan's Creek and Hail the Conquering Hero. Although my brother Chris will, without question, consider this nothing short of blasphemy, I didn't really care for them. I thought they were okay at best. But then again, I hate a detour, so what the hell do I know? Preston Sturgis was born Edmund Preston Biden on August 29, 1898 in Chicago, Illinois. Born into a wealthy family, he started helping out with stage productions starring his mother's best friend, Isadora Duncan. An aside here, Isadora Duncan died as a result of one of the more bizarre accidents in Hollywood history. She was in Nice, France, and was wearing a long, flowing, hand-painted scarf given to her as a gift from Sturgis's mother, Mary Desty. Desty begged her to wear a cape in the open sports car she was traveling in as it was a cold night, but Duncan insisted on only wearing the scarf. As they departed, Duncan called out, "I am off to love." And when the car took off, her scarf got caught in the wire wheels, which yanked her out of the car and broke her neck, killing her instantly. While it's not quite as legendary a death as the death of, like Lupe Velez, it's worth repeating. I thought so, anyway. After serving in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in World War I, he returned to his mother's company, Maison Desty, and invented a kiss-proof lipstick in 1920. Shortly after his first marriage, his mother demanded that he return control of the company to her and forced him out. He became an inventor, coming up with a ticker tape machine, an intaglio printing process, and several other inventions that didn't achieve much success. He turned to writing, and while laid up recovering from an appendectomy, he wrote his first play, The Guinea Pig. He produced a number of plays which didn't do too well, and he ended up moving out to Hollywood to make money. He became a writer-director and soon grew frustrated over the lack of control he had over his films. He made a deal with Paramount to write his next film, 1940's The Great McGinty, for a low pay rate in exchange for the final cut of the film. This began the series of films he made that established him as a major talent. He became the highest-paid screenwriter and director in Hollywood and was one of the highest-paid people in the country. His films are indeed unique, dealing with some taboo subjects such as unplanned pregnancy in 1944's The Miracle of Morgan's Creek, corruption in 1940's The Great McGinty, and poverty in 1941's Sullivan's Travels. Married 4 times, he was a womanizer who had intense difficulty maintaining a monogamous relationship. His mother, who was what could be kindly called a free spirit, had a habit of having flings and relationships with several people of both sexes at once while raising him, so you could say he was a product of his upbringing. He became an independent filmmaker and had a string of poorly received films, which led him to being labeled an expensive perfectionist. After forming a company with Howard Hughes in the late 1940s, he made tonight's film, The Sin of Harold Diddlebock. The company was dissolved when Hughes, not the most predictable of millionaires, changed his mind and withdrew funding. Sturgis then moved to France and made what turned out to be his last movie, 1955's The French, They Are a Funny Race. While working on an autobiography entitled Events Leading Up to My Death, he died of a heart attack while living at the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan on August 6, 1959. Harold Lloyd was born Harold Clayton Lloyd on April 20th, 1893 in Bouchard, Alaska. Born to parents who constantly battled and wound up divorced, he had a more emotional attachment to his father, J. Darcy Lloyd, than his domineering mother. He made his stage debut at the age of 12 in Omaha and then moved to California with his father after a settlement from an accident in 1913 gave him some money. His father, Foxy, bought a pool hall which soon went under, and finding themselves broke, Foxy suggested that his son see if he could land a position with the Edison Motion Picture Company, who were making a film at San Diego's Pan American Exposition. It was on that set that he met fellow extra Hal Roach. Roach told Lloyd that he was going to be a producer someday and would make Lloyd his star. That's exactly what happened. After inheriting a fair amount of money, Roach and a partner, who he later bought out, bought a small studio called Fun, that's P-H-U-N, Fun Films, and began making the kind of movies Roach wanted to make, comedies. After making a handful of films starring Harold Lloyd, Roach landed a distribution contract with Pathé, a French company. Their first shorts featured Lloyd playing characters called Willie Work or Lonesome Luke, which were basically cheap knockoffs of Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp films. Lloyd hated playing the character, feeling that ripping off Chaplin's work was lazy and immoral. He then created his Glasses character, a young all-American type who would succeed regardless of the obstacles in his path. His new character began to catch on, and soon he was cranking shorts out at a rate of 3 per month. In 1919, just as his career was starting to take off, he was seriously injured when a prop bomb he was holding for a publicity photo turned out to be the real thing and blew off his right thumb and forefinger. To cover his injury, he wore a flesh-colored glove, which you can spot if you look closely. Lloyd chafed at working for Roach, however. He admitted himself that he didn't want to work for anyone, and he left Roach for the greener pastures of Paramount. Lloyd was a man of contradictions. He would fall in love with a woman but never commit. He was generous with his co-workers, but conversely could be incredibly cheap except when it came to himself, and he was almost pathologically superstitious, insisting on leaving by the same door he entered, dressing in a particular order, and then addressing in reverse order, or expecting his chauffeur to know what unlucky streets to avoid when driving. As he became wealthier, he indulged in some rather strange hobbies, like raising Great Danes, collecting automobiles, and collecting high-fidelity stereo equipment. He would often contact record companies and buy their entire catalog at one time. He was known for having one of the greatest collections of records in the world. He was open-minded concerning homosexuality, but was an absolute martinet when it came to the behavior of his daughters. Conversely, he was a chronic womanizer, often contracting VD through his various affairs. He continued to crank out films during the 1920s and was soon making more money than Chaplin, although that was probably due to the fact that Chaplin agonized over every foot of film he shot and took as long as necessary to get them perfect. It was during this time that he made one of his most famous films, 1923's Safety Last. Even if you've never seen this film, odds are you're familiar with this scene from it. The short was a huge hit and gave Lloyd the reputation of being a comic daredevil. Not to stick any pins in that particular pretty red balloon, but Lloyd was too valuable to allow him to risk his life in this manner. Additionally, he was terrified of heights, so the wide shots of Lloyd climbing the building actually were done by an amazing stuntman by the name of Harvey Perry. Now, what you have to realize is that during the silent era, there was no such thing as back projection or green screen. All the stunts you saw in silent films were done for real. Perry entered the business before the term stuntman had even been coined. In the superb documentary series Hollywood, A Celebration of the American Silent Film, created by David Gill and Kevin Brownlow, Perry remembered, a good stuntman, his mind needs to be at least 14 feet ahead of his body. That's the way to stay alive, you know? The extras would sit on this big bench outside the studio playing cards or shooting craps until the casting director would come out and say, anybody want to make $10? They wouldn't say, what do we got to do? They'd say, yeah, I will. All right, so the guy would go up there and they'd say, okay, jump off this building. So he'd jump off the building. If he made it, okay, fine. And if he didn't, well, you got free room and board in the hospital for a while. Cameraman and later director Byron Haskin recalled, Harvey was the greatest guy behind the wheel of a car that I've ever seen. He would go through windows, over cliffs in a car that would defy your intelligence to figure out what he was thinking of, how he was going to survive these damn things. Harvey would take the lead and he would come out of a cloud of smoke into something he'd never seen before and figure it out in midair. He had the guts of a wildcat. Now, rather than make you sit and listen to the explanation of how the stunt in Safety Last was done, I'm going to show you a clip from the documentary addressing that very scene.
The idea that Harold Lloyd climbed the building entirely alone has long been accepted, but he didn't.
I doubled Harold, and every precaution that I wanted in climbing the buildings and so forth, anything protection I wanted, I could have. The only one thing I couldn't have is publicity, which was all right with me. I didn't care. What did it mean to me? Nothing. I never mentioned that I doubled Harold Lloyd until Harold passed on.
The human fly in this shot is Harvey Perry. This is Harold Lloyd. Lloyd was a capable athlete who achieved a great deal of the climb himself, but he could hardly be exposed to a 100-foot drop. So how was the rest of the climb achieved? Remember, there was no back projection. Lloyd had to be as high above the ground as he appeared to be. The answer was as simple as it was ingenious.
We built a set on top of the 14-story building that would be maybe 2.5 stories in height. Right on the edge, facing in toward the roof of the building. Now, when they photographed it in such an angle that it looked like it was on the opposite side of the street, and you could see all that traffic underneath you. Where if Harold did fall, or I did fall, doing some things that were a little more dangerous that you wouldn't want to do up at 14 stories, we'd only fall maybe 15, 16 feet. And we'd have pads down there in case he did fall. Harold Lloyd a lot of people didn't know it, only had part of a hand. On his right hand, it was blown off by a firecracker in a still picture one time. If you ever notice, he'd hang mostly with his left hand because he couldn't hang with the right.
Lloyd wore a special glove to conceal his missing fingers, so his disability was never apparent.
Harold couldn't stand height, although he did safety last and feet first and those things.
Pretty cool, huh? These are the things Hollywood legends are made of. The advent of sound led to Lloyd's career taking a nosedive. He was a silent comedian, and his writers were used to creating silent comedies, so dialogue wasn't exactly their strong suit. He started out the transition strongly, with 1929's Welcome Danger grossing $3 million, but the grosses for his following films began to decline sharply. After 1936's The Milky Way lost $250,000, Paramount demanded that any overages in the budget would have to be met by Lloyd himself. After a couple of other bombs, Lloyd's screen career was pretty much over. He was 45 years old. He dabbled in producing and other things, but really got hooked by photography, in particular experimenting with color. The earliest Technicolor tests were shot at his 36-room mansion called Green Acres, and from there he moved into 3D color photography, shooting a lot of portraits during the 50s and 60s, shooting mostly nudes of glamour models. His collection of 3D stills numbered 250,000, most of them nudes. As the owner of his films, he was able to pick and choose when and where they'd be shown. He never released his films to television, fearing that incorrect projection speed and being interrupted for commercials would damage his legacy. He did, however, release a couple of compilation films, one of which, 1963's The World of Comedy, did quite well. Harold Lloyd died from prostate cancer on March 8, 1971 in Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, California. It really bothers me to criticize the sin of Harold Diddlebock the way I do, but the fact stands that the movie just isn't that great, and unfortunately it was Lloyd's last screen appearance. He had 214 films under his belt at that time, and he was far from destitute. Instead of blowing his money, he carefully invested and died a very wealthy man. It's just, I don't know, it seems very old-fashioned and not in a good way. The character of Harold is, as I said at the outset of this intro, a bit of a tight ass, and while his perseverance is admirable, some of the things he does are rather disturbing. You'll see what I mean when you watch the movie. I mean, who knows? You may like it better than I did. So right now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the sin of Harold Diddlebock right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.